Hi, KubeCon. That's pretty loud. So my name is Mark Angrish. I'm from ANZ Bank, and we're here to talk to you today about how we speed up delivery and scale out with Kubernetes, and how we've decided to approach governance and automating that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape that we operate in to give you a bit of a better understanding of that. How it was being used at the moment to enable organizational agility for us. And then besides the software supply chain stuff that you might have seen this related to, we're going to talk a little bit about Grafeas and Kritis and how we enforce that organizational governance that is important to us. And then if we pray to the demo gods, actually there's only going to be one god that you'll have to know about. Whoops, where is he gone? There he is. It's Fippy, so thank you CNCF for allowing us to use this. But Fippy is the demo god, so please pray to the demo god Fippy so our demo works. So my name's Mark. I am what's known as a tech area lead in ANZ Bank in engineering acceleration. I've been an engineer for about 15 years, mostly working across the US, UK, and Australia, mostly in financial services, high-frequency trading, and stuff like that, and a little bit of startups. I'm now a senior manager at ANZ, and my last open source commit was, I think, April 2017, so don't hold that against me, KubeCon. And now I'm responsible for helping the bank go faster. And I'm just going to introduce Satyam here.
Morning, folks. My name is Satyam. I'm a lead consultant with ThoughtWorks. As you can see, marketing, I've done my job. And I've been with ThoughtWorks about 7 years now. Work with a bunch of different clients across different geographies, mostly in the financial services space. Working very closely with Mark over the last 5 months or so as the lead engineer on the engineering acceleration team.
And what's really interesting is that I found out I have more GitHub activity than he does, and that tells you something.
That he's older.
So this is our building, ANZ. It sits about 6,500 people. We're about 50,000 employees, and about 10% of that is tech. We're about 183 years old, and we're based in Melbourne, Australia. We're the third largest bank by market capitalisation out of the big 4 banks that operate in Australia. And we have about 10 million customers worldwide, and we operate in about 33 geographies, including this one. So also, if anybody fancies a trip to Australia in a one-way direction, just talk to me afterwards. Okay, so let's get into it. This is how we deliver today at ANZ. You can see it's pretty hard. It looks messy. It hurts my eyes actually just looking at that. There's a lot of paths to get stuff out to our customers there. So as you can see, we predominantly create really unique solutions, and this leads to a heterogeneous way of delivering value to those customers. So there are obstacles everywhere. You can see we've got cops, we've got potholes, we've got all sorts of things. And this is the typical experience that one of our delivery teams would have in terms of getting something out to a customer. So they need to get lots of approvals and guidance from a whole bunch of different parts of the organization, including security, architecture, networks, mainframe, integration environments, someone's phone. And this is, like I said, the typical experience that one would expect when delivering something to a customer. So the speed is very slow. So customers do see value that we do, they do get it, but it's very infrequent. And in today's ecosystem of disruption, especially in the banking sector, this is something that we can't really live with anymore. And this really directly affects the way we also do governance. And the reason for that is we need to support all these different ways of delivering value to customers. And that is not an easy thing to do for us, because like I said, each one of them requires its own unique solution. So I'm just really going to quickly blast through this. This is governance. It's really the balance between value and risk. So I'm just going to read this because I wrote this last night and it makes sense to me, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. It's the set of structures, processes, and policies by which we build, deliver, and maintain software within an organization so as to yield business value and mitigate risk. That sounds pretty cool. Not really. On one side, we're worried about things like reputational damage, financial loss for the organization, financial loss for customers, outages, etc., which can get us in trouble with the regulator. and anything else that might actually cause customer dissatisfaction. As an engineer, it's really important to understand the risks in which your organization operates in. So it's really crucial that we have those things in mind when we're building out, whether it's the CI/CD pipeline or anything. Value should be pretty self-explanatory. It's the business value you create for your organization, and you use your elite coding skills to do that. But put another way, governance is really the action your organization takes to balance its value against risk. But sometimes it actually feels more like your organization might operate like this. So why is that? Why are we in this kind of mode? So the prudential regulator in Australia takes outages and incidents really, really seriously, and so do we. All the banks in Australia do. And so like many organizations, when something really bad happens, it causes us to re-examine our governance. So we go to that second line of, looking at our change controls. And then we might ask ourselves some questions. We might tighten a few things. We might say, even in some cases, maybe people need to step up, Is it a people problem? Is it a process problem? We re-examine all these things. And then what that causes is actually this re-examination to tighten and change your organizational policy around change. And when you combine that with the technical landscape that I just described before, what you get is a harder way to do a change, and it gets amplified. So what we end up doing is bunching up our changes into larger and larger releases, which again it slows down our cadence, and then releasing itself actually becomes an arduous effort. In fact, sometimes it takes a weekend to do a change. Sometimes it actually takes several weekends to do a change. And so that in turn increases our operational risk, and then we do more testing and we don't catch something, and then that in turn causes an outage to happen again, and we continue the cycle. And this might be yearly or something like that. But if you've read the book Accelerate by Dr. Nicole Forsgren and her friends, you'll know what are some of the causes of this. So I'm not really going to dive deep, but that's a good book. You should definitely have a read. All right, good news time. ANZ is changing. Here is our CEO. He is leading the change. He wants to make us more agile. This is a digital transformation. Everyone's doing this. We're in the middle of ours. We want to unleash our organizational agility. We want to combine the worlds of business and tech. One of the most important things about this, though, it's created the impetus for change, and cultural change is actually half the battle. And this is what we've restructured ourselves to. This is actually really important to know. I promise I'll link this all up later. The design of our new organization has several philosophies, but this is largely the Spotify model, if you're familiar with it. The key thing here is the squad. The squad is multidisciplinary, autonomous, and guided by missions. Now, you can think of ANZ as actually having several hundred of these squads. And the important thing to understand about this is that it's actually the organizational structure is really important. And why is that? Conway's law, right? Hopefully everybody knows what Conway's law is, but those of you who don't, it's that your architecture will look like your software will resemble the organizational structure that you have. So what are the implications of that? Our smaller teams here are more likely wanting to produce smaller, more cohesive services than stitching together giant monoliths. And this obviously closely aligns to microservices type philosophy. So we have squads, but how do they address their missions? How do we unleash their autonomy given the culture, the current landscape that we operated in that I showed you before? If they could, they would probably want to build infrastructure for their own squads and release their own things, right? Because that's economically what they're probably going to be primed to do. They're going to want to, maybe create their own CI/CD for what they're doing. There might be subtle variance between each one of those squads in how they approach it. But that's really inefficient. Our engineers could actually be working on delivering customer value rather than setting up CI/CD pipelines. So this is just a random pipeline that you might use to deploy something onto Kubernetes. So how can we scale this sort of pipeline at an organization like ours? We can try and take a patternized approach. We can say to people, oh, this is what we've done, you might want to copy it. That's not too bad. We can centralize some of these services like Jenkins or SonarQube or whatever and then expose those out, and people can stitch together their own pipelines for what they're trying to do. That's also not too bad. Teams can also, who are further ahead, can actually come back and show other teams how they've done things. And that's actually pretty good as well. That's the Sherpa model. And that's also pretty good. These all encourage scale, but for us, that's not ambitious enough. The start of our talk, this is about industrialized CI/CD pipelines, and this isn't industrial enough for us. So how do we do that? We get Chuck Norris to do it all, yeah. No, so we use automation, right, to industrialize so that it makes things easy for our engineers. So we're at KubeCon. We know microservices and Kubernetes go hand in hand. It creates that layer of abstraction for our engineers, and more importantly, it becomes a lingua franca for different parts of the organization in different roles. Everybody can talk this language. So for ANZ's digital transformation, Kubernetes is that catalyst that we needed for that organizational agility that I spoke about earlier. So what's great about this is now our squads not only they just need to know their stack, they need to know Docker, and they need to know the concepts that exist in Kube, and that's like good enough for the most part for them. And it also has implications for our workforce management. It means we don't have to hire everybody knowing the depths of Kubernetes, right? Or even below that stack at the IaaS level. So if we think of Kubernetes as unlocking organizational agility, then managed Kube actually in the cloud acts as an accelerant for us. All right, I'm just going to spend a bit of time on this. So we use Terraform to provision the core banking infrastructure, which is completely Phoenixable for us. This means things like Artifactory or BlackDark, as well as Grafeas, which we'll talk about in a bit, are all provisioned on the sort of this primary setup for connecting out to GCP. On top of that, we've exposed services like, or modules, I should say, like GKE and Cloud SQL and stuff like that. And these are all also all done through Terraform. And what that means is that this allows us, from the app pipeline level, that if a cluster doesn't actually exist at the initial creation of the pipeline, it will go off and provision that cluster before it continues on with the app pipeline. So it's really, I guess it's kind of like a way that you can bootstrap the whole pipeline before anything's actually ever happened. So we actually do this per asset level. So in your own organization, you might have a different definition of what an asset is, but for us, it's a collection of services that we uniquely bundle together. And then that, at the same time, will provision something like Spinnaker and the rest of the CI/CD pipeline for that particular asset. The key message here is that the whole thing is automated. So switching to the developer perspective, what do you need to know? You're really merging a pull request, and then that triggers like what you see, and the last thing you see is your app in production or a particular environment if we have manual intervention in here. So the key thing is that, like I said, the whole thing is completely automated. The CI/CD pipeline, though, becomes the only way that you can deploy apps into GKE. So there is a lot of detail missing here, like how we do secrets management and how we set up our projects in GCP around VPC peering and stuff like that. Actually, Google is helping us out with some of this stuff because it is a bit experimental. But if you want to talk to us afterwards, we can tell you a bit more about that. So while the cloud presents a really good opportunity, this newfound freedom presents challenges, though. If we're undisciplined with the way we act in the cloud, it reproduces some of those problems that I talked about earlier, and it actually amplifies them. So this is things like cost blowout and stuff like that. So this is especially true if we're running, say, unmanaged Kube as well, because that means my team is on the hook for having to support all the stuff that sits underneath that as well. So as we move to the cloud in GKE, how do we keep our estate well managed? And how do we effectively control risk? All right, you know the answer to this because I said it at the start. It's governance, right? So this is what we call the paved road, and we completely stole this terminology from Netflix, so thank you, Netflix, for coining that. And we're inspired by the companies like them and Capital One and ING. And what we've done is we've taken the typical experience that I mentioned earlier, and what we've done is we've worked with different parts of the organization that I mentioned earlier, like security, governance, audit, etc. And we've actually combined them into this way to get to production quickly. And we've added our own opinion on how we want to actually make this happen. And what we've used, obviously, is Kubernetes as that base. And we've created a platform over the top of it. So the key principles of our platform are improving the developer experience, increasing the speed, and the agility that we were sort of requiring for our organization. We want to increase the safety and security of the way we put things out, so we're getting less and less in terms of incidents, and we want to abstract delivery using continuous delivery as a service. So while Kubernetes simplifies our architectural landscape, the homogeneity required to allow us to scale, that's requiring another balanced item here, which is, again, the governance. So the paved road, by the way, is a value proposition. We don't mandate this on our teams. What we do instead is we have a product mindset with this, and we actually listen to our users and where they've actually got problems, and we actually then try to take care of those particular things in a prioritized order. But the developer experience and the balance between change, so that governance thing, is really critical for us. All right. Governance can be modeled here as a set of control points up the top there. So what you need with that is evidence that you have actually met those control points. So we typically do this at the moment with change control boards, and we might use governance forums and things like that, but this is really heavy. So we've changed this new structure that energizes and provides empowerment to our teams to deliver value. But the governance that we have at the moment is kind of done via a handbook. You tell us how you're going to get this thing done. And for ANZ, that's for each team, they have to kind of work out over about 50 plus mandatory and situational control points, how they're actually meeting those particular bits of governance. But the important thing about this, though, is that you can consider each one of these things as metadata about your SDLC, right? So each one of these steps is actually a bit of metadata about how you met that control point. So how can we stitch this with our paved road that I talked about earlier to make releasing not only quick, but safe and well-governed? So how can we enforce governance as code? I'm just going to pass over now to Satyam, who will talk through how we do this.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so we've got all of this structured metadata that we want to capture and want to use to make decisions about whether we should deploy changes into environments or not. So how do we do this? Enter Grafeas and Kritis. Grafeas is an open source metadata API that allows us to capture structured metadata about our build and release process. Kritis is an open source solution that allows us to create policies and enforce the integrity of our software supply chain using that data that we collect in Grafeas. Container analysis and binary authorization are essentially managed service versions of Grafeas and Kritis that GCP offers. So subsequently, when we talk about in the slides about Grafeas and Kritis, we're really referring to the managed service versions because that's what we've been working with. All right, so there are a few key concepts that we've got to be familiar with to understand the ecosystem better. So the first is notes and occurrences. What are notes? Notes are essentially definitions of metadata that we're interested in. So for example, if a new vulnerability is found in a Node.js library, you can create a node gets created which details which provides details about the vulnerability. For example, the CVE number, the severity, the versions of the library that it impacts. For every artifact that is produced in our pipeline or every artifact in our artifact storage like Artifactory that contains this vulnerability, we create an occurrence object. Right? So there's a one-to-many relationship between notes and occurrences. Occurrences are instantiations of notes. Let's take another example. If you want to track the deployment history of an artifact as it goes through your different environments and you practice binary promotion, you want to track that history. So if you have a note, a deployable note, which lists down the details of the artifact, and an occurrence in that situation is every time that artifact was deployed into an environment, what was the date that it was deployed, time that it was deployed, who deployed it. Those can become those constitute the occurrence, associated occurrence for a deployable object. For the purpose of governance, we are interested in a specific kind of note called an attestation. Attestations are special because they have the notion of trust associated with it. And how does it do that? It's linked to an attester object, which is really just a container for a public key. The associated private key it sits with a human or a machine actor that represents a control point in that governance process, right? So, for example, it could be a design review by an architect or a unit test stage in a CI/CD pipeline. You can use this private key to create the attestation occurrences, right? So it's a signed piece of, the attestation is a signed verification that that particular process or that particular control point has been satisfied. And the more important thing here is that that attestation can be verified using that public key. So we'll see this in the demo. The next concept to be familiar with is a binary authorization policy. Bin-auth policies allow us to define the entry criteria for a GKE cluster. This criteria is in the form of a list of attesters. What this means is that any container that is going to be deployed into the GKE cluster must have attestations from each of those attesters before it is allowed entry into the cluster. If this sounds very familiar to an admission controller, you'd be spot on because that's how bin-auth is actually implemented behind the scenes. So what's key over here is that if every attestation represents a control point in our governance process, then this policy essentially represents your governance as code, right? All right, so we've talked about notes, occurrences, specifically about attestations, and then bin-auth policies. So how does this all stitch together? So let's give you an overview of the demo that we're going to go into. We're going to take a demo app. We're going to make a change to it, push it through Cloud Build, and create a container, push it to container registry, and then trigger a deployment pipeline in Spinnaker. And we'll talk a bit through Spinnaker when we go through the demo. Because our GKE cluster has binary authorization enabled, the attempted deployment will trigger the admission controller, which checks with binary authorization if that particular attestation is present for the container. The first time around, it's not going to be present. So that attempted deployment will fail and our changes are not going to be deployed into the cluster. The second time around, we are going to create the attestation before we trigger the deployment. And this time, hopefully, if the demo gods are with us, that deployment should succeed. All right, let's get into the demo. And I love this picture.
I like how it's a CI/CD demo. Very specific.
All right, I'm going to have to switch my display so that, oops.
And just so if you didn't catch that, this is going to be on GCP, the demo, in case it wasn't clear.
All right, so we've got a demo app running in a kube cluster. It's a little gray like the weather right now, and that's what we're going to try and change. We're going to try and brighten this up a little bit. Just a quick, sorry, just can people at the back see, or do you need me to increase the size? Yeah, up. Is that good? Up? Okay. So we've got the app deployed into a GKE cluster as well as Spinnaker deployed into the same cluster. Let's go over to the code, and we're going to try and change the color. I'm going to try something completely random. I have no idea what this code is actually going to do. Hopefully it's brighter. Now, go over and not there. And I have no backup video of this, so we're really living on the edge over here. So hopefully the demo gods are with us today.
Pray to Fippy.
Pray to Fippy, exactly. All right, so that should have triggered off a build in Cloud Build. There we go. While that is happening, I will just take you to the binary authorization setup in GCP. So the policy that we spoke about, you can see that here. It essentially lists one attester object that every container that is being deployed to the GKE cluster must have. And how does that association work? Binary authorization essentially forces this policy on every cluster within this project. For a more real-world setup, you can actually have a multi-project setup, where you can have policies in one project, and that can apply to clusters in other projects, and you can have cluster-specific rules as well. The associated attester is shown here, which really just is a container for a public key. Right, so that's how the setup looks like. If you go over to Cloud Build, that has created an image. And let's just check that image is landed up in container registry. Yep, right there. This should have triggered a pipeline in Spinnaker. So I've got Spinnaker running here. You'll see that the pipeline's been triggered. It's waiting so that just for the demo purposes. I'm going to try and deploy this change, and hopefully it'll fail.
Yeah, so we've inserted a manual stop here. So Spinnaker can just automatically release this, but we've got a manual trigger in here.
Just while the demo is happening, a quick explanation about the pipeline. It's a very simple pipeline, which essentially fetches a manifest file from cloud storage bucket, and it fetches the image from, because of a pub/sub trigger, it fetches the image from GCR and tries to deploy it to a cluster. All right, so let's have a look at the deployment. So we can go over and into the cluster, and if you look at the workload, you'll actually see the error show up there, right? That container with this particular image digest was denied entry because no attestations were found that were valid or that were trusted by an attester, which is defined in that policy. Okay, so we've got this situation here. Now we're going to try and deploy this again. And this time we'll create an attestation before we trigger the deployment. You know, we should try a different color this time, maybe something more specific.
I think I have a color for you. There is ANZ Ocean Blue. It's a lovely color.
I'm sure you must remember the hex code for that. Right?
Oh, it's very easy to remember that hex code. It's 007 DBA. If anybody has a good joke about that, please let us know. We tried and we couldn't get one.
Too tired, I think. All right, let's push that through. Something about James Bond being a DBA or license to, I don't know, I'm not going to try. This is all being recorded, I should remember. All right. That should have also triggered off another build. There we go. Just one thing to remember is that while we're showing this in the world of containers and GKE, the principles really apply to any sort of deployment process. It could be VMs, it could be, but it's just that the majority of the ecosystem has to increase to support different kinds of workloads as well. There is no reason why automation of governance process through attestation should apply only to a container. It's just that we don't have the right tooling available to implement this in a VM world, but that is something that we do have to work towards. That's still going. All right, there we go. Let's check that our pipeline is triggered. But before we trigger the pipeline, we're actually going to go into the terminal and generate the attestation. So what we need for that is the image digest, because we're going to create attestation for this image digest. And that's how we identify the image through the entire process, or the artifact through the entire process. All right, so I'm just going to put that into an environment variable. And I'll talk through the entire process so you have a better understanding of what we're doing. First thing that we're going to do is the binary authorization API has a helper method to create a signature payload. So this is essentially a JSON payload which represents that me, the authority, in this case, a human actor, for instance, if I'm a QA doing exploratory testing and I signed off on this particular artifact, right? So I'm going to just create a payload which I can sign. Let's have a look at this payload. It's really simple. Oops. It's just the location of the artifact, right? So it's got the repository location and the image digest, which identifies that artifact. So what we're going to do with that payload is we're going to sign it using a private PGP key on my local system. There exists a signature, so we can overwrite that. All right, that should have created our signed, our generated signature, which we can use to create the associated occurrence, the attestation occurrence. Right? So it's just a signed signature. It's just a signature of that content that I just showed you. We're going to now create the attestation. And there we go. So this is essentially, again, can be driven through the API. We can create an attestation. We're providing the artifact URL and just a few other pieces of information that the API expects.
So by the way, you could actually use a wrapper over this, like a GUI. So you could use so we actually have something like this, where you can manually, a human actor can actually manually create this for certain steps in our governance pipeline.
And that's really going to be critical when you talk about human actors who have to create attestations. You don't want every person in the organization who's responsible for signing off on a governance control point to be going to the terminal and generating these attestations. That people are going to be like, that's not going to work for us. So let's just quickly check that the attestation has been created as soon as I find that command. And you're going to see a huge blurb of text over here, but if we look for this particular, SHA, there's an attestation created for it, which is associated with this public key. Now, if we go over to Spinnaker and try again, hopefully this should work.
Come on, Vippy.
Okay, let's see. And we refresh, and refresh, and refresh. And there we go.
Hey.
And our deployment is now going through. Right? So our changes are now being deployed onto the cluster because that attestation is present. And this is really critical because you can provide that assurance to your governance functions, your compliance functions historically, which aren't very trusting of whether you've completed a process or not, in order to make sure that you have actually met the control points.
Show me that ocean blue.
Let's check. All right. There
Yay! We go. All right.
And we've got to switch over now.
Okay, so just as you're switching over, really just the thing that we want to want you to walk away from this is that you can actually, what do you want? I think you got to...
Searching for the slides. Oops.
I think you just killed our presentation.
I think I might have. Oops. No.
Okay.
Just talk about it.
Okay, so really, oh, there we go, it's back.
Okay.
Yep. So, there we go. So basically you can improve the governance, you can improve your governance process and also increase your speed and scale at the same time. Your governance doesn't have to slow you down.
The other one is just, we got to make it easy to do the right thing. Right? So if you make it easy to do the right thing, people will not look for exemptions or take on the additional risks that they don't want to.
And the last thing that we want you to know is that if you are in a heavily regulated industry, things like Grafeas and Kritis can actually help you, codify your governance process. But more importantly, this gets us to another area that we really want to start pushing industry towards, which is regulation as process. So working with the federal regulator or whoever you are to just basically streamline this all together.
Lastly, we just want to call out that there is a lot of work happening in the ecosystem. Especially want to call out the work that's happening at Google, but also at Shopify. There's some links here to projects that are being undertaken or tutorials that are being created to educate people about the ecosystem.
Okay.
I don't know how we're doing on time.
I think we got 2 minutes or something. But yeah, if you do have any questions, let us know. It is close to lunchtime too, so I'm hungry. But if you do want to talk to us, just come on over. Or if you have any questions, let us know.